What happens when a legendary actor loses his cool on live television? In just 42 seconds, Michael Caine went from charming guest to walking off the Loose Women set in what's being called the most explosive moment in daytime TV history. Before we dive into this absolute mess, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. We bring you daily videos exposing Hollywood's darkest scandals, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Last night's episode of Loose Women was supposed to be a celebration. Michael Caine, the iconic British actor known for his calm demeanor and legendary career, was sitting across from the panel to talk about his latest projects. The show had been promoted all week. Viewers tuned in expecting charm, wit, and those famous stories from Hollywood's golden age. But what started as friendly banter quickly turned into something nobody saw coming. The studio lights were bright, almost too bright, casting everything in that artificial glow that makes daytime television feel both intimate and exposed. The audience was packed, every seat filled with people excited to see a legend in person. Coffee mugs sat on the panel's table, steam still rising from them. Everything seemed perfectly normal, perfectly safe. Michael sat comfortably in his chair, wearing a smart blazer, looking every bit the distinguished gentleman. That familiar voice of his filled the room as he chatted with the hosts, telling a funny story about working on one of his early films. The audience laughed at all the right moments. The other panelists smiled and nodded. It was exactly what everyone had expected. Denise Welch, never one to shy away from controversy, was leading the conversation. She'd been warm and welcoming at first, asking about his career, complimenting his recent work. But anyone who knows Denise knows that's usually just the warm-up. She smiled at him, leaning forward with that look she gets when she's about to ask something provocative. Her eyes narrowed just slightly, and if you were watching closely, you could see her whole posture change. "Michael, we've got to address something," Denise said, her tone shifting slightly. The smile was still there, but it had changed. It wasn't warm anymore. It had become something else, something sharper. "There's been a lot of talk recently about some of your older films and certain scenes that, by today's standards, might be considered problematic. Some people have been calling them outright inappropriate, offensive even." The shift in the room was immediate and palpable. You could feel it like a temperature drop, like someone had opened a window in winter. The other panelists glanced at each other with expressions that said they hadn't been briefed on this line of questioning. Their eyes went wide. One of them subtly shook her head, as if to say, "Don't go there." The audience went from relaxed and entertained to alert and uncomfortable. You could hear the shuffle of people adjusting in their seats. Michael's expression didn't change much at first, but if you looked closely, if you really watched his face, you could see something flicker in his eyes, a warning sign. A flash of something that said, "Careful now." He adjusted in his seat, crossing one leg over the other with deliberate slowness, maintaining that professional composure he's known for, that he's perfected over decades in the public eye. "Well, Denise," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, the way someone walks through a minefield. "I think we have to understand the context of when those films were made. Different times, different sensibilities. The world was a very different place 30, 40, 50 years ago. Society had different norms, different expectations." It was a diplomatic answer, the kind he'd probably given 100 times before in various interviews over the years. The standard response. The safe response. The response that usually makes interviewers nod and move on to the next question. But Denise wasn't going to let it slide that easily. "Oh no, this was just the beginning." "Context," she repeated, nodding slowly like she was considering his words very carefully. But her eyes told a different story. They were sharp, focused, hunting. That's an interesting word. Context. People love to use that word, don't they? But don't you think, as someone with your influence, someone who's been looked up to by millions of people around the world, someone who shaped how people see the world through your films, you have a responsibility to acknowledge when things were wrong, when things crossed a line, when things caused harm? Michael uncrossed his legs and leaned forward slightly. His voice remained calm, but there was an edge creeping in now. "I'm not sure what you're asking me to acknowledge, Denise. Are you asking me to apologize for films I made 40, 50 years ago? I'm asking you to acknowledge that they were problematic, Denise pressed, her voice getting sharper with each word. I mean, we can't just hide behind, "It was a different time," can we? Wrong is wrong, regardless of when it happened. One of the other panelists, clearly uncomfortable, tried to soften the moment. "I think what Denise is trying to say is—" "I know exactly what Denise is trying to say," Michael interrupted, his famous voice taking on a steel quality. "And I'm simply saying that judging the past by today's standards is a dangerous game. A very dangerous game indeed. We did what we thought was right at the time. We made art that reflected the world as it was." "Art?" Denise's eyebrows shot up. "So, objectifying women and perpetuating harmful stereotypes is art?" The audience gasped quietly. This was getting ugly fast. Michael's jaw tightened visibly. His hands gripped the arms of his chair. "That's a gross oversimplification of complex films, and you know it. You're taking scenes out of context, out of the narrative, and using them to make a political point. That's not really an answer, though, is it?" Denise shot back, leaning even further forward. "That's avoiding accountability. That's dodging the question." The audience went absolutely quiet. This wasn't the lighthearted chat they'd expected when they'd queued up outside the studio that morning. This was turning into something else entirely, something uncomfortable, something explosive. Michael leaned forward in his chair, his eyes locked on Denise. His famous voice, the one that had narrated countless films and delivered iconic lines, took on an edge that rarely comes through. You could hear the decades of experience, the weight of a long career, and the frustration of someone who felt cornered. "Accountability?" he said, and the word hung in the air like smoke. "I've been in this industry for over 60 years. 60 years, Denise. I've worked with everyone from the greatest directors to the most talented actors. I've treated people with respect, conducted myself professionally, and made films that millions of people around the world have enjoyed and loved. I don't need to be lectured about accountability by someone who's been on television for a fraction of that time." Oh, that hit a nerve. You could see it in Denise's face immediately. The color drained from her cheeks for a split second, then rushed back in a deep red flush that crept up her neck. The other panelists looked absolutely uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, eyes darting between the two combatants, completely unsure whether to jump in or stay quiet and let this play out. "Excuse me?" Denise said, her voice rising an octave. She sat up straighter in her chair, her whole body language changing from interviewer to fighter. "So, because you've been around longer, you're above criticism?" That's exactly the attitude that's the problem. That's the exact mentality that allows bad behavior to continue unchecked for decades. "No," Michael countered, his voice getting louder, filling every corner of the studio. "What's the problem is people like you trying to rewrite history to fit your narrative. You sit here on your high horse, judging people who were making art, real art, when you were still in school. You weren't there. You don't understand what it was like." The producers behind the cameras were frantically signaling now, waving their hands, trying to get them to pull back, to de-escalate, to go to commercial. But it was too late. The train had left the station, and there were no brakes. This thing was going to crash, and everyone knew it. Denise stood up from her seat suddenly, the movement sharp and aggressive. She pointed a finger directly at Michael, her hand shaking slightly with anger. "Are you seriously going to sit there and act like we shouldn't question anything from the past? Like we should just accept everything because that's how it was? Is that really what you're saying right now?" Michael's face darkened. He pushed himself up from his chair, matching her stance. At that moment, the cozy talk show set felt more like a boxing ring. "I'm saying that context matters. Context always matters. And I'm saying that I don't appreciate being ambushed on what was supposed to be a pleasant interview. I was told this would be a friendly chat about my career, not an interrogation." "Ambushed?" Denise's voice was shaking with anger now, her words coming faster. "Asking you to take responsibility for your work is an ambush? Asking you basic questions about representations in your films is an interrogation? This is exactly why nothing changes in this industry. Because people like you refuse to have these conversations. You shut them down the second they make you uncomfortable." "No," Michael shouted back, his composure completely shattered now. "This is you trying to make a name for yourself by attacking someone who's actually accomplished something. This is you trying to create a viral moment for your show by ambushing a guest." The studio went dead silent. Even the audience, who'd been murmuring and gasping throughout, went completely quiet. You could hear the hum of the cameras, the buzz of the studio lights. That was a line that probably shouldn't have been crossed. That was personal. That cut deep. Denise's face went from red to almost purple. Her eyes widened, then narrowed into slits. When she spoke, her voice was low and dangerous. "How dare you? How bloody dare you say that to me? I've been speaking up about important issues for years. Actual important issues that matter to people. While you've been coasting on your reputation and collecting paychecks." "Coasting?" Michael's voice dripped with disbelief and barely contained rage. "Coasting? I've worked harder than you could ever imagine. I've been on set at 5 in the morning and worked until midnight. I've performed in the rain, in the cold, through injuries. I've given everything to my craft, and I'm not going to stand here and be insulted by someone who thinks asking provocative questions makes them a journalist." That last word came out like a slap. Journalist. The way he said it, with such disdain, made it clear exactly what he thought of Denise's credentials. One of the other panelists, her voice small and shaky, tried desperately to interject. "Let's all just take a breath here and—" "No!" Denise cut her off sharply, not even looking at her colleague. Her eyes were locked on Michael like a laser. "No, we're not taking a breath. Michael, if you can't handle being asked legitimate questions about your career, about the impact of your work, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews anymore. Maybe you should just stay home and count your money." Michael let out a bitter, harsh laugh that echoed through the studio. "Legitimate questions? This is a witch hunt, plain and simple. This isn't journalism, it's a kangaroo court. You invited me here under false pretenses just so you could have your little moment. So you could grandstand and virtue signal for the cameras. False pretenses?" Denise's voice was reaching a fever pitch now. "You were invited here to have a conversation, an honest conversation, not to dodge every difficult question that comes your way, not to hide behind your career like it's a shield. There's a difference between a difficult question and an accusation," Michael said, his voice dropping to something cold and controlled, which somehow made it even more threatening. "And you've crossed that line about 5 times in the last few minutes. You're not asking questions. You're making accusations, and then framing them as questions." The tension in that studio was suffocating. The air felt thick with it. You could see the other hosts trying to figure out what to do, their eyes darting between Michael and Denise like they were watching a tennis match from hell. The audience members were frozen in their seats, phones out, recording everything. "Maybe," Denise said, her tone dripping with condescension, each word deliberate and cutting, "if you actually listened instead of getting defensive, if you actually tried to understand the point being made instead of protecting your precious ego, you'd understand what I'm asking you. But clearly, that's too much to expect." That was it. That was the moment everything exploded into something unrepairable. "Defensive?" Michael's voice boomed across the studio so loud that someone in the audience actually jumped. "I'll tell you what's defensive. Defensive is attacking someone's entire career, their life's work, because you need ratings. Defensive is hiding your own insecurities behind fake moral outrage. Defensive is building yourself up by tearing others down." The audience gasped collectively, a sound like wind rushing through the room. Even the cameramen seemed shocked, their cameras wobbling slightly as they tried to capture every second of this meltdown. Denise's mouth dropped open. For a second, just a second, she seemed genuinely stunned into silence. But only for a second. "Fake moral outrage? You arrogant bastard! Just because you've been in a few films, just because you've had a successful career, doesn't mean you get to waltz in here and disrespect me on my own show. This is my show." "Your show?" Michael laughed again, but there was no humor in it whatsoever. It was harsh and cutting. "This isn't your show, Denise. You're part of a panel. You're one voice among several. And clearly, the power's gone to your head. You think because you're on television, because you have a microphone, that makes you important. That makes you judge and jury. Get out," Denise said suddenly, her voice shaking with pure rage. Her finger jabbed toward the exit. "Get the hell out of this studio. Get out right now." Michael stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The studio was so quiet you could hear people breathing. His eyes moved from Denise to the other panelists, to the audience, then back to Denise. Slowly, Deliberately, he reached up and unclipped his microphone, the small sound of the metal clasp opening echoing in the silent studio. He held it in his hand for a moment, then let it drop onto his chair, where it landed with a soft thud. "Gladly," he said, his voice icy calm now, which was somehow more frightening than when he'd been shouting. "I've wasted enough of my time here already. I came here thinking I was meeting professionals. Clearly, I was mistaken." "You're damn right you have," Denise spat back, her voice cracking slightly with emotion. "And don't expect another invitation. Ever. You're not welcome back here." "Oh, don't worry," Michael said, straightening his jacket with a sharp tug. "You couldn't pay me enough to come back to this circus." He turned to face the audience, and for a second, it looked like he might say something to them, might apologize for the scene they'd just witnessed, but he just shook his head slowly, disappointment written all over his face, and started walking toward the exit. "That's right. Walk away," Denise called after him, her voice echoing through the studio. "Just like you're walking away from accountability? Just like you've walked away from difficult conversations your entire career?" Michael stopped dead in his tracks. His whole body went rigid. For a moment, everyone thought he might keep walking, might take the high road and just leave. But slowly, very slowly, he turned back around. The look on his face made everyone in the studio hold their breath. It was controlled rage. Years of frustration, all focused into one moment. "You know what, Denise?" he said quietly, but his voice carried across the entire studio like thunder. Everyone leaned forward to hear. "I came here today because I thought it would be a pleasant conversation. I've done hundreds of interviews over my career, maybe thousands. I've met thousands of people, worked with hundreds more. And I've always tried to be respectful and professional. Even when the questions were tough, even when I disagreed, I stayed respectful." He took a step back toward the set, his hands gesturing as he spoke. "But you're not interested in conversation. You're not interested in understanding or dialogue or even honest disagreement. You're interested in confrontation. You're interested in creating a moment, a clip that'll go viral, something that'll get you talked about. And I'm not playing that game. I refuse to play that game. It's not a game when it's about real issues." Denise shouted back, but her voice wavered slightly. "It's not a game when it's about holding powerful people accountable. You can't just dismiss it like that." "No, you're right," Michael replied. And for a second, it looked like he might back down. But then his expression hardened again. "It's not a game. You're absolutely right about that. It's your ego. This entire thing, this whole confrontation, it's about your ego. You need to be seen as the one who challenged the big star, the one who wasn't afraid to ask the tough questions. But you're not asking tough questions, Denise. You're grandstanding. There's a difference." "How dare you?" Denise started, but Michael cut her off. "No, I'm not finished," he said firmly. "You want to talk about accountability? Fine, let's talk about it. I'm accountable for every film I've made, every role I've played. I stand by my work, but I'm not going to apologize for making films that reflected their time, that told stories about the human condition as it was understood then. Art evolves, society evolves. We all evolve, but you can't judge the past with the morality of the present. It doesn't work that way." "That's just an excuse," Denise fired back, finding her voice again. "That's what everyone says when they don't want to admit they were wrong." Michael shook his head slowly, sadly almost. "No, it's not an excuse. It's reality. It's how the world works. But you don't want reality. You want simple answers. You want me to fall on my sword so you can feel righteous. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but that's not going to happen." He turned back toward the exit again, and this time his steps were more determined. His shoulders were back, his head high. He wasn't running away. He was choosing to leave. "Fine, leave!" Denise yelled, and now her voice was definitely cracking. You could hear the emotion breaking through, whether it was anger or hurt or frustration. "Run away like you always do from difficult conversations. That's what your generation does best, isn't it? Run away and pretend problems don't exist." But Michael didn't stop this time. He didn't turn around. He didn't give her the satisfaction of another reaction. He just kept walking, his footsteps echoing on the studio floor like a drumbeat. The cameras followed him, capturing every step, every moment, of this absolutely unprecedented walkout. "This is unbelievable," Denise continued, talking to the cameras now, to the audience, to anyone who would listen. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. The second you challenge them, the second you ask them to think about their impact, they walk away. They can't handle it." But her words were falling on deaf ears because everyone was watching Michael, watching him walk with dignity and purpose toward that exit, watching the end of what was supposed to be a pleasant interview, watching television history being made. Michael reached the studio door and paused for just a fraction of a second, his hand on the door handle. For a moment, it seemed like he might turn around one more time, might have one final word. But he didn't. He pushed the door open, and the bright white light from the hallway beyond flooded into the studio. Then he stepped through, and the door swung shut behind him with a heavy, final thud that seemed to echo forever in the stunned silence of the studio. The door closed. Michael Caine was gone, and the studio sat in absolute, complete silence. The audience sat frozen, not sure if they should clap or gasp or do anything at all. Some had their hands over their mouths. Others were still holding up their phones, recording. The other panelists looked at each other in complete shock, their faces pale, clearly not knowing what to say or do. One of them had tears in her eyes. Denise stood there, still on her feet, breathing hard. Her chest was rising and falling rapidly. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, shaking slightly. She looked at the camera, then at her fellow panelists, then back at the door that Michael had just walked through. The door that was now closed. The door that separated her from what had just happened. "Well," she said finally, her voice shaky and uncertain. She tried to compose herself, to regain some of that confidence from before. "I think we all just saw what happens when you try to hold someone accountable, when you try to have real conversations about real issues. They walk away." But her words fell completely flat in the stunned studio. Nobody nodded in agreement. Nobody clapped. The other panelists just stared at her with expressions that were hard to read. Were they supportive? Were they shocked? Were they angry? It was impossible to tell. The magic was broken. The interview was over. And everyone knew that the footage of Michael Caine walking off the Loose Women set was about to become the most talked about moment in daytime television history. This wasn't just a disagreement. This wasn't just a heated interview. This was a complete and total breakdown of what was supposed to be a simple promotional appearance. The cameras kept rolling because nobody knew what else to do. They captured everything. Denise sitting back down slowly, her hands trembling as she reached for her coffee mug. The other hosts attempting to smooth things over, to pivot to something else, anything else. Someone mentioned going to a commercial break. Someone else tried to laugh it off, to make a joke that landed like a lead balloon. But everyone knew. Everyone watching at home, everyone in that studio, everyone behind the cameras. They all knew what had just happened. They had all just witnessed a complete meltdown on live television. A legendary actor walking out mid-interview. A host who'd pushed too hard. A conversation that had spiraled completely out of control. Behind the scenes, you could imagine the chaos. Producers were definitely scrambling, trying to figure out how to handle this. Studio executives were already on their phones. Social media was probably exploding with clips, opinions, hot takes. But in that moment, in that studio, there was just silence and shock and the lingering echo of Michael Caine's final words before he walked out that door, never to return. The empty chair where Michael had been sitting seemed to dominate the set now. His microphone still lay on the cushion where he dropped it. A glass of water, half drunk, sat on the small table beside the chair. These small remnants of his presence somehow made his absence even more stark, even more dramatic. Denise looked at that empty chair, and for just a second, just a flicker, something crossed her face that might have been regret, or doubt, or maybe just exhaustion. But then it was gone, replaced by that defiant expression, that determination to believe she'd been right all along. The show would go on. They'd figure out how to fill the rest of the time. They'd bring up other topics, other discussions. But nothing would erase what had just happened. Nothing would change the fact that Michael Caine had walked off their set, and he wasn't coming back.